The silence didn't just break, it detonated. And this time, it wasn't a whisper from palace corridors or a vague tabloid hint. It was something far more dangerous, far more personal, and far more explosive. Because the files being talked about right now aren't rumors, they're being described as pieces of a past that was never meant to resurface, and at the center of it all stands Prince Harry, reportedly blindsided, reportedly shaken, reportedly realizing that the story he thought he knew might have been edited long before he ever walked into it. The silence has officially been broken, and insiders are claiming that what's now surfacing isn't just casual gossip, but fragments of something much deeper, the so-called Toronto Years files, a phrase that has suddenly appeared across private media circles, whispered in closed rooms, and quietly passed between journalists who are being told to wait before publishing because the implications are not just personal, they are structural, they are reputational, and they may change how everything is understood about the rise of Meghan Markle. Because here's where the tension spikes. This isn't coming from an outsider, not from critics, not from commentators, but from the one figure who existed before the reinvention, before the royal spotlight, before the global narrative took shape. Trevor Engelson, the man who for over a decade said nothing, sold nothing, revealed nothing, until now when suddenly the word files is being attached to his name. And that changes everything. And what exactly are these files? That's the question that's now spiraling across every layer of this story, because insiders are not calling them a memoir, not calling them an interview, but something more controlled, more precise. Documents, timelines, private exchanges, moments frozen in a version of reality that predates the Duchess title, and if even a fraction of what's being suggested is accurate, then what's emerging isn't just a story, it's a counter-narrative. Because the Toronto years weren't just a chapter, they were the foundation, the period when everything was being built quietly, strategically, and according to those now speaking behind the scenes very intentionally. This was the era of long-distance routines, of separate cities, of growing ambition, and according to those who claim to have seen early glimpses of these alleged materials, it was also the era where shifts began to happen that were never publicly acknowledged. Think about that for a second. The version of events that the world accepted, the timeline that was told, the way certain beginnings were framed as coincidence rather than direction. What if those versions weren't entirely complete? What if there were pieces missing? Not because they didn't exist, but because they were never meant to be seen. And this is where the pressure reportedly hits hardest inside that Montecito world, because the reaction, according to those close to the situation, hasn't been calm, hasn't been dismissive, hasn't been the quiet confidence of someone unconcerned. It's being described as controlled chaos, legal teams suddenly activated, communications tightening, and a very specific focus on one question: how much of this can actually surface? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that's now hovering over everything. If there was never a formal agreement, if there was never a binding silence, then the gate that kept that past contained might not actually exist anymore, and that means whatever is inside those files is no longer locked to memory. It's potentially movable, shareable, and most importantly, believable. And while all of this is building in the background, the one person who is said to be feeling the weight of it in real time is Harry himself, not in a dramatic public display, not in statements or reactions, but in something quieter, something more telling: distance, hesitation, a shift in presence that insiders are now describing as observant rather than involved, as if he's no longer just inside the story, but starting to look at it from the outside. Because imagine that realization, that the version of someone you defended, protected, and built your life around might have had layers you were never shown, moments you never saw, decisions made long before you entered the picture. And now those moments are being talked about, analyzed, and possibly documented in ways that can't simply be dismissed as rumor. And it doesn't stop there, because what makes this development feel even heavier is the timing. The way these alleged files are surfacing at a moment when other pressures are already closing in, when public perception is shifting, when support systems appear quieter than before, and when every new headline seems to carry more weight than the last. Which raises the question no one is saying out loud, but everyone is thinking: is this just the beginning? Because if these Toronto Years files are real, if they contain even a portion of what insiders are hinting at, then this isn't just about revisiting the past, it's about redefining it, reframing it, and potentially exposing the difference between what was shown and what was lived. And right now, the most unsettling part of all isn't what has already surfaced, it's what hasn't. The pieces still being held back, the details still being verified, the the story's still waiting for the right moment to land. Because in a situation like this, the first wave is never the biggest. And what comes next doesn't just deepen the story, it starts tightening it, pulling every loose thread into something that feels less like coincidence and more like a pattern that was always there, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Because as the whispers around these so-called Toronto Years files grow louder, something else is happening at the same time. The reactions, the subtle shifts, the small but telling changes in behavior that insiders say are impossible to ignore anymore, especially when it comes to Prince Harry, who is no longer being described as reactive, but as someone quietly processing, watching, and perhaps for the first time questioning. Because here's where the narrative starts to crack in a way that no PR strategy can easily repair. It's not just about what those files might contain, it's about what they represent. A version of events that existed before the global spotlight, before the carefully constructed image, before the interviews, the documentaries, the polished storytelling that shaped how the world sees Meghan Markle today. And when a past like that begins to resurface through the one person who lived inside it, the risk isn't just exposure, it's contradiction. And insiders are now claiming that contradiction is exactly what certain circles are preparing for, because the alleged contents of these files aren't being described as dramatic outbursts or emotional confessions, but something far more unsettling, calm, dated, detailed accounts of moments that could challenge the timeline the public believes it understands. And that kind of information doesn't explode loudly, it spreads slowly. It seeps into conversations, it plants doubt, and once that doubt is there, it becomes almost impossible to remove. This is why the tension isn't just inside Montecito anymore, it's stretching outward, reaching into media rooms, legal discussions, even quiet royal circles where, according to whispers, the situation is being observed very carefully, not because of personal interest, but because of potential impact. Because if those files contain anything that intersects with the timeline of how everything unfolded after the Toronto years, then the consequences don't stay private, they ripple outward in ways that can't be predicted. And while all of this is building in the background, another layer is beginning to form. The silence of people who used to be loud, the absence of public support that once came quickly and confidently, the noticeable shift in who was willing to stand close and who was choosing to step back. And in a world where visibility is everything, that kind of silence speaks volumes, because it suggests that even those who once believed the story are now waiting to see how it evolves. Meanwhile, the situation between Harry and Meghan is being described in ways that feel increasingly distant, not in dramatic confrontations or visible conflicts, but in subtle separations, different schedules, different priorities, different focuses, as if the weight of everything happening externally is starting to create space internally. And that space, according to those watching closely, is where the real change begins. Because think about what this moment represents for Harry, a man who walked away from one world to fully commit to another, who defended that decision through criticism, through backlash, through years of public scrutiny, and now finds himself in a position where the foundation of that new world might be facing questions he never anticipated, questions tied not to the present, but to a past he wasn't there to witness. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once, it builds piece by piece, detail by detail, until suddenly the narrative you trusted starts to feel incomplete. And when that happens, the instinct isn't to react loudly, it's to step back, to observe, to reassess, and that is exactly what insiders say is happening now. A quiet shift that speaks louder than any statement ever could. At the same time, the conversation around Trevor Engelson is transforming completely, because for years he was a footnote, a name occasionally mentioned but rarely explored, a chapter that seemed closed, but now, with the idea of these files, he's being repositioned as something else entirely, not just a former partner, but a potential source of clarity, someone who holds pieces of a timeline that others can only speculate about. And that shift in perception is powerful, because it changes how every word, every detail, every possible revelation will be received. And here's where the pressure becomes almost unbearable, because if even a small portion of what's being suggested begins to surface publicly, it won't arrive as one single moment. It will come in waves, each one adding more context, more questions, more scrutiny, and with each wave, the ability to control the narrative becomes weaker, until eventually control isn't possible anymore, which brings everything back to that original shock, the one that insiders say hit hardest when the phrase Toronto Years files first started circulating, because it wasn't just about the past coming back, it was about the realization that the past might have been preserved in a way no one expected, documented in a way that doesn't rely on memory or interpretation, but on records, timelines, and details that don't change. And in a world where perception is everything, that kind of stability in a story can be the most dangerous thing of all, because the truth, or at least the version of it that feels closest to reality, doesn't need to be loud to be powerful, It just needs to exist, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And right now, that moment feels closer than ever because the files are no longer just a rumor. They are a possibility. And for the first time in years, the story surrounding Meghan Markle isn't being driven solely by her voice, her perspective, or her narrative. It's being challenged from a place that predates all of it, from a time before the titles, before the transformation, before the world was watching. And that makes this situation fundamentally different from anything that has come before. So the question now isn't whether something will surface. The question is when, and more importantly, how much.